Okay, thanks everyone for joining the webinar today, Balancing Static and Dynamic, how Mailchimp launched a new entertainment hub with Gatsby. A couple announcements before we get started. My name is Linda Watkins. I'm Director of Marketing at Gatsby, and I'll be introducing our speakers in just a moment. But first of all, I just want to say welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar is being recorded, so if you miss any portion of it, you can catch the recording on our website, which will be posted later today. Also, all the attendees will be on mute during the presentations and the Q&A. So if you have questions, and as you have questions throughout the presentations, please submit them with the question chat window. And we'll make sure that we have time at the end of the presentations to get to those questions, especially for any ones that we aren't able to answer during the presentations. So be sure to submit your questions in the chat window. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So we have Sarah Mogin, who's a developer at Work & Co. And also Amy Hollis, product manager at Work & Co. And Dustin Schau, head of customer success at Gatsby. And I just realized I have more about their bios, but sorry, don't have my split screen. So I'll have to come back and give more of an introduction for them in just a moment. A few more announcements though. You can also follow us on Twitter at GatsbyJS. And if there's questions or discussion that you want to have on Twitter, we'll be monitoring that as well. And we do have live captions, which you can find the link in the chat window, or you can go to gatsby.dev/captions. And if you'd like to see the live captions for this webinar. One other point there is once we have the recording posted, the recording of the webinar will have captions on the video as well. So I actually have a poll to get everybody started. Then the first question is, can you build a PWA or a progressive web app with Gatsby? So go ahead and take a minute to cast your vote, either yes, no, or maybe you don't know yet, which is fine. Great, I'm seeing some answers come in now. So go ahead and make sure you cast your vote real quick. And then I'm going to close the poll in just a minute. All right, great. We have like over 75% voted. So let's share the results. Okay, great. We have a very informed audience. A lot of people saying yes, 81%. Some folks don't know yet, which is totally fine. That's why you're here. So quickly, I'm going to give a little bit more of an intro to our speakers, and then we'll start with our first speaker. So Sarah Mogin got her start fiddling with CSS and HTML on LiveJournal, and then attended App Academy in 2013 to pursue web development professionally. But now Sarah builds mobile and web applications at Work & Co. and works on projects including Aldo, Epic Games, and Planned Parenthood. So Amy Hollis started off as a film studies major in Boston and moved to New York City to pursue all types of production, such as live action, post, and digital. And now Amy is a product manager at Work & Co., working on projects for Mailchimp, Fox Sports, and T-Mobile. And then actually our first presenter is Dustin Schau, who is head of customer success at Gatsby. And he helps our customers tackle big technical challenges. He's also very passionate about all things JavaScript and Gatsby, of course. And so with that, I'm going to pass the controls over to Dustin.
Awesome. Thanks, Linda. And thanks for that intro. So anyone who follows me or has been to some of these previous webinars, this topic is dear to my heart. So I definitely want to turn those 19% of I don't know if Gatsby can build a PWAs into 100% yes. So that's my goal. I just want to illustrate today my kind of like high-level thesis is that not only can Gatsby be used for what we're calling PWAs or dynamic web apps, but that Gatsby should be used, and Gatsby is like an excellent choice for this kind of application. And so the notion of Gatsby as SSG or static site generator, I kind of want to provide some clarity to that notion and kind of talk through what Gatsby does and how Gatsby is really an excellent choice for your next web application. So just kind of more color to Linda's intro. Like she said, my name is Dustin. I am previously and always the open source team. I'm still an engineer at heart. Still engineering nearly daily. I just moved to the Bay Area, Mountain View, California, which is a big change for me. And I am engaged to a triplet. So my fun fact is not about me. So that is me and my fiance and at Oktoberfest a few years ago. So what I want to do is I want to take this notion that many people have of, Gatsby is just like a static site generator, right? And I want to take this notion and like turn it on its head. So Gatsby is an SSG. Gatsby does this really well. Gatsby will parse, your React code, and it'll produce static HTML, static assets, which is like a great model. But when I hear this, I think, well, yes, but like actually more importantly, no. So Gatsby does produce static assets, but it doesn't produce a static app. And so what I want to do today, like I said, is I want to show that Gatsby is an excellent choice for your next dynamic web app. But when we talk about web apps, I think a really natural question is like, what even is a web app? When we use the term PWA, when we use the term dynamic web app, like what do we really mean? And for me, I think of a few hallmarks, a few characteristics that define the kind of like feel and like the like technical the like technical features that are present when I'm using a quote unquote web app. So the first of which is dynamic data. So data that is like fetched from the server, can be a REST call, can be a GraphQL call, data that isn't present at build time, but that is present at runtime is what I call dynamic data. Client-side JavaScript. So things like animations, things like interactions, things that make your app feel like a lively app, which aren't, typically seen as like static site generator things. These are kind of hallmarks of a really nice app-like experience. So when you use something like Twitter, there's a fair amount of like client-side JavaScript that makes that experience feel as app-like or as like appy as possible. Authentication. So this is a really common one. So when you're using a web app, you'll often have to like authenticate. You might be using OAuth or like a JWT, and authentication is one of the key considerations that you kind of like see and feel when you're using a web app. And then of course, PWA functionality, kind of harkening back to that initial poll question. So PWA, progressive web app functionality, more of like a Chrome and Android thing, but when you have this website, you want to use these platform features that enable your website to feel as much like an application as possible. And so what these kind of like constitute is that there's this great quote from Justice Potter Stewart, and he says, perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, defining the concept, but I know it when I see it. And I think this holds true for applications. It's kind of like contrived and arbitrary to like make a checklist of what an application is, what's the line between static and application. And for me, I think it's most helpful to like look through applications so that we inform our mental model of what a web app is. And for me, there's two key ones. So Gmail, anyone who's using Gmail, you get this sense that this is an application. This, is effectively just as powerful or nearly as powerful as like a desktop native application. And it's built using web technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc. And so Gmail is one of the first, at least that I think of, kind of like proof of concepts that the web is a great platform for building out these dynamic web applications. And then in the same way, I think of Twitter, particularly the mobile Twitter, as really great illustration of a responsive, nice PWA. The experience on desktop for mobile Twitter is just as good, if not better, than the actual Twitter application. And this is a great proof of concept for how we can make a performant web application using these app-like technologies, PWA features, etc. And so, the kind of key idea here is, like, what if I told you that Gatsby is a web app? When you're building with Gatsby, you're producing a React application, which once it hits the browser is a fully dynamic web application. And so my mental model for Gatsby is not of the static site generator, although it does do that quite well. My model is that Gatsby is an app compiler for React. We internalize, all of the complicated tooling, things like Webpack, Babel, and the end result is that we provide like functionality so that you can just focus on writing your application with technologies that you love, like React, GraphQL, and Node. And we'll do the heavy lifting. We'll do the performance optimizing, and we will create a highly optimized static site that once it hits the browser is going to be a fully functional dynamic React application as well. So the model I hold for Gatsby is that of the app compiler rather than that of the static site generator. And so one of the key ideas here is that Gatsby is, just React. There are some caveats, you might have seen some of them in that you can't use like a window global because it's going to be generated in a Node runtime. But for the most part, and for most purposes, Gatsby is just React. Gatsby produces a React application. So this kind of understanding, this high level kind of like tweak of the model makes some kind of questions actually quite easier. So like a really common question from like a web app perspective is, how do I do authentication in Gatsby? And for me, the question isn't so much, how do I do authentication in Gatsby? It's how do I do authentication in React? Because it's really the same answer for both. And so the idea here is that you probably have an authorization API. You could be using a service like Auth0. You could have like rolled your own and might have some OAuth application that you use internally. What you'll need to do is invoke this authentication API. Oftentimes we use React context to share this authentication state with any child in your tree. And then you can use this notion of like private routes to kind of like segment and prevent users from accessing those private routes. And so these three concepts kind of like naturally flow into each other. And this is how I would do authentication in a React application. And the like key idea here is it's the same for Gatsby, because Gatsby is a React application. And so some like pseudocode-ish of what this could look like is we'll create an authentication provider. We're using hooks here because hooks are awesome. Although you could certainly write this as a class. So here we're setting up our authentication state. We have a set authentication helper. On mount, on this use effect, we're going to fetch our authentication status, and then we're going to set whether we are authenticated or not, and then we're going to expose helpers to our application to log in and log out. And so this is really the high-level idea for how we can provide authentication status to any component in our Gatsby application tree, because it's a React application. So again, same idea here is, how do I do progressive web apps in Gatsby? The question is, how do I do progressive web apps in React? And so how you do them in React is you want to tie in to some platform features. So typically this might be a service worker, this is going to be a manifest, and you're going to use these technologies among others to kind of get like a jump start on your progressive web app. And what you can actually do with Gatsby is you can use our platform, you can use our ecosystem for a shortcut. And so the two main plugins that jointly constitute a progressive web app experience, the first of which is Gatsby plugin offline, which will get you, which will register a service worker and enable your application to work offline. We recently launched a 3.0. It's a nice new feature, so definitely check it out. And then Gatsby plugin manifest, which will generate the web app manifest, which can be used by Chrome, Firefox, others to give you a native app-like feel for your web application. So again, how do I do dynamic requests in Gatsby? Really, it's React. So same idea here is here we have a pseudocode type example of fetching tweets. So on component mount, we're going to fetch some tweets. We'll set tweets, and then we'll render the dynamic data in a list view, or really whatever we want to do here. So the idea here is that even though Gatsby does produce a statically optimized application, because we're producing a React runtime, because we're producing effectively a React application, you can do anything that you can do in React, which includes dynamic data calls. So here's the one caveat. I said in general, it's just kind of like we pass through to what React does because we are a React application. Client-only routes is a mechanism in which when you navigate to a particular route, you're going to then have no static optimization, and it's just going to be a route that is rendered purely in the client. So in Gatsby, we do have a little spin here. We recommend using a plugin called Gatsby plugin create client pass, which will look like this. And so you can do this manually. The plugin just kind of encapsulates it and makes it a little bit nicer of a developer experience. And so here what we're saying is that when the user navigates to the app route /app, that's going to be a client-only route. And so from there, we're going to let the client handle the routing. And so what this looks like in practice is something like this. So we're kind of bringing this all together. We have that authentication context. Here we have a protected route so that we're kind of restricting access to just the user or admin routes. And then by default, we'll show the login. And so this is what an app-like experience would look like with client-only paths in Gatsby using some of the concepts we've been talking about. So again, key takeaway here is, how do I do like X, Y, and Z in Gatsby? More often than not, the answer is, how do I do that same thing in React? Because again, Gatsby is just React. So what I've shown thus far is that you can build apps with Gatsby. What I haven't shown, the really important twist here, is that you should build apps with Gatsby. And so what I want to do is I want to show a few key things that Gatsby does that I think makes Gatsby so appealing and like an excellent choice for your next web application. First of which is, of course, this idea of static rendering. So Gatsby renders your React application as much as possible at build time. And so there are huge benefits. You get quicker TTI. You can kind of like maximize your performance scores by rendering upfront as much as possible so that you don't offload that request to the user. And so this key idea of statically generating as much as possible is what makes Gatsby applications feel so fast. We have a vibrant plugin ecosystem. So if you want to do thing X, thing Y, or thing Z, oftentimes there's a plugin so that you can focus on delivering that great app experience without like reinventing the wheel every time. And you can leverage what our incredible community has and will continue to contribute. And again, it is just React. So in the same way that you can leverage from the previous slide our plugin infrastructure, you also have the entire power of the React ecosystem. So if you want a great component, if you want a great component library, if you want to deliver an engaging app-like experience with nice animations, the React ecosystem is thriving. And so you can oftentimes deliver that experience much more quickly by using React and by using Gatsby. And so finally, I'd like to talk briefly about a really great performance optimization that we enable with Gatsby plugin offline, which is app Schau. And so on the left, we have a Gatsby application, and then on the right, we have an application that's rendered from a server. And so what we're doing here is we are rendering effectively the exact same content, but you can see on the left, it feels like it loads much quicker, even if by the time the page is fully ready, the same content is there. And so the idea here is that with the app Schau, we can render a kind of skeleton of the page, which makes the application feel perceptibly faster, even if it's not actually faster. And so the app Schau is a great way to kind of maximize the user perception of how fast your application is. And so here, the idea here is that perceived performance, kind of thinking through the example on the left, is just as, if not more so important than actual performance. And so my key takeaway here is that when you use Gatsby, you can really eliminate the trade-off between actual performance and perceived performance. There isn't, an either/or dichotomy. It's use Gatsby, and you can get the best of statically optimizing. You can get the best of client-side and app-like features, and you can really deliver that engaging experience that your users really want. And so what we oftentimes hear is that there's fast, and then there's Gatsby fast. When you're navigating a Gatsby application, you oftentimes feel that it feels perceptively faster, and that's because we're doing some really great performance optimizations. I have a blog post if you're interested in reading more about these that we do to enable this perceptive performance and kind of like maximize the actual user experience of navigating application. We'll like preload routes, we'll optimize images, and the end user experience is one that it feels like this application is even faster than they even thought possible. And then this is really enabled through some things we do in Gatsby. And so, don't just take my word for it. There are lots of great applications built with Gatsby. As a kind of proof of concept, I built this Gatsby mail application. So we're not pivoting into the mail business just for fun. It's totally open source. And so what you can do is you can use this Gatsby mail application. It's kind of like a clone of Gmail, not quite as powerful, of course, because I built it in a day and a half, but definitely check it out. The code can be quite helpful to kind of bring some of these ideas home to show that Gatsby not only can be used for web apps, but that Gatsby should be used for web apps. So that's all. That's all from web applications. Key takeaways are Gatsby not only can be used for apps, I think Gatsby should be used for apps. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Linda.
Yeah. Great. Thanks so much, Dustin. Appreciate that. And before we go to our next presenters, we have one more poll. So just curious, how many of you are building websites with Gatsby already? So yes, no, or maybe you've started a project but haven't quite finished it yet. So go ahead and put your vote in, and we'll just give you a minute. Oh, great. People very fast voting. We're over 75%. So I'm going to close the poll and share the results. Okay, a lot of Gatsby users already, 58%, which is great. Some started projects and some not quite yet. Perfect. Thanks for participating with that. Okay, now we're going to pass the controls over to our next presenter, Sarah and Amy with Work & Co. And I'm going to give you guys the controls. You'll just want to unmute as well. So we can see your slides, we just can't hear you yet.
Hey, sorry, we should be unmuted now.
Yep, sounds good.
Great. I just wanted to give my little parrot more time on the screen. That's what that was all about. So we'll start by introducing ourselves. My name is Sarah. I'm a lead developer here at Work & Co. As Linda mentioned, I've worked for some cool clients here like Aldo Shoes, Epic Games, the people behind Fortnite, and Planned Parenthood. I'm also a very proud graduate of the App Academy Dev Bootcamp. So if anyone out there is like on the fence about becoming a developer and has friends who are, tell them to talk to me. I've contributed to Gatsby in the past with a few PRs, and I had so much fun on my first Gatsby project I wrote a blog post about.
Hey guys, this is Amy. I'm a senior product manager at Work & Co. I work on projects for Mailchimp, which we'll look at today, also for Fox Sports and T-Mobile, so a whole variety of different clients. I live in Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy to be specific, love it. And my background is in film studies, but I've just been really interested in all things production. And the film studies background really lent itself to this particular project that we're getting into today. So I'm really excited to share it. Just to start, wanted to give you a little bit of background on Work & Co. So our mission here, we're a product company, is to define and launch the digital projects that people use every day. And we are a private company. We were founded in 2013, growing a lot. So we have about 309 employees and offices all over the world. Our main one is in Brooklyn, but we have a big development force in Belgrade, design and development in Sao Paulo and Rio, and also some offices in Copenhagen and Portland. And this is a fun slide just to say that we're really excited about creating work and designing work that actually does get built and made and launched and shipped into the world. So that's a big part of the types of projects that we take on. And over the past year, we've launched about 18 products and about 50 since we first started. So that's always a big, important part to everyone at the team here. And this is just a simple grid of some of the clients that we work with. One thing that is good to note is that we work really closely with these clients. So it's not the type of situation where we go away and work in the shadows for a month and then come out with a big reveal. We're usually talking to our clients all the time, several times a week. We're opening up sketch files. It's very raw. And the one thing that we really try to help our clients do is to listen to users. So user testing is a big part of our philosophy. And I'll get into that a little bit when we talk about the process for the Mailchimp project. Project background. So Mailchimp, for anyone who's not familiar, they are mainly known for their email marketing capabilities. They are a private company. They are still private with no venture money and run by their two founders, and they're valued at $4 billion. So they're wildly successful with what they do. And for the moment, they've mostly been kind of looking to capture the small business owners. That's kind of their target audience, people who may or may not be familiar with marketing, but Mailchimp makes it easy enough that they can do it. So right now, they really focus on entrepreneurs, small business owners, and they have a track record for doing really unconventional marketing. If anyone's familiar with the podcast Serial, they first put their name out there by sponsoring that. They got the name wrong, and then they made a whole campaign about people saying their name wrong. So they have a lot of different quirky campaigns that really kind of just show how fun the brand is and authentic, and that's why this project was actually really cool. So they came to us this time, and they really wanted to start to tell stories instead of ads to their customers about what it's like to be a small business owner and kind of the ups and downs of being an entrepreneur. And so when they came to us, they actually had invested a lot of money in a lot of different types of production and content. So they had podcasts, videos, scripted comedy series, docu-series, full-length documentaries, animated shorts, and they worked with really great media partners like Vice. They worked with the production company that did Queer Eye, so they really had some heavy hitters and made content that looks really great. I highly encourage all of you guys to check it out if you want. But that was sort of the ask for us, was they had all this content and they wanted to create a way to reach more people that weren't necessarily Mailchimp customers. So they thought they could do that by making entertaining content. So the first kind of goal was to raise awareness for Mailchimp for people who may not be familiar. And two, kind of true to their brand, they wanted to make something creative and fun, which is always a cool project to be on. So our initiative at Work & Co was to design and build that media hub for their new content destination that they call Mailchimp Presents. And just to give you some background on the timeline, it was 6 months from concept to launch, which we're pretty proud of. So it was kind of a soup to nuts effort, and we had control over the whole process. So concepting phase was about 6 weeks. And throughout concepting, we really throw a lot of different options at the wall and see what sticks. We did 2 rounds of user testing. And one of the things that we really need to think about, especially with media, was where users would be coming in from. So a lot of these people would be watching on their phone, and we wanted to provide, simple, effective ways to get from social channels right into the site. And then once they got there, will they know what they're looking at and all of that? So we went through concepting, landed on a direction, and then we started to build out all of the different templates. And it ended up being a fairly simple site in terms of the design and visual. The real piece of it that we're really proud of is the development. It's very simple and smooth. And one of the things that we did was to really just focus on making it super easy for users to get straight into the content. This was our development schedule. It was 13 weeks. I'm sure you guys are familiar, but we just sort of broke it out into sprints, and Lauren can definitely talk about it a little bit more than I can, but I will share with you guys a demo just of the site. Cool. So we did focus on mobile just because we felt like that's where a lot of the people would consume the content. But it's a really simple site. It has all of the shows. This is actually live now. You click into it, it takes you right there. It starts playing. We have a sticky kind of video player at the top, and it's really meant to allow people to browse all the available content that we have. We also have podcast pages, and again, sticky navs that allow you to keep browsing while you're listening on the go. So we really considered what the user would be doing during these times. We have simple navigation, watch, listen, recent, and it's just really cool types of content that, again, you should definitely check out. And then just going back to this, the presentation. So we did check in with our client and just asked how it was going, and they weren't able to give us exact numbers yet because they were kind of being chic about it. But from a business perspective, it's doing incredibly well. We found that people who are exposed to the Mailchimp Presents content before they sign up are way more likely to pay us and pay us more quickly and pay us more. So it's really amazing. I think in the short
Looks like we may have lost audio. So Sarah and Amy, if you can hear me, if you can check your audio.
Gatsby, which we all know and love.
Sorry, we just lost you for a minute, but your audio is back, Sarah and Amy. So if maybe you want to go back to the last slide and keep going from there.
Sure, sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the tech behind Mailchimp Presents and kind of how we were able to achieve those results for them. So the stack for Mailchimp Presents was pretty simple. We started with Gatsby, which is the website framework we all know and love. Contentful, a headless CMS we use a lot here at Work & Co. Netlify, an automated CI and CDN platform that I find works really well with Gatsby and Contentful. And we used Wistia to host our videos and SoundCloud for the audio podcasts. So start off, I wanted to mention I'm kind of like the Gatsby lady here at Work & Co. I had the chance to lead our first Gatsby project, which was for another client called the Whittle School, and that was also a Contentful and Netlify project. So I'm going to kind of fold in some of my experiences about that as well when I talk. And I did have so much fun that I wrote a blog post about it. So check that out if you're more curious. For this project, that positive experience was one reason we picked Gatsby. We had used it on the Whittle School and then also on a site for Planned Parenthood and had found it to work really well. Another big motivator was that we just love React here at Work & Co. We have a lot of React Web and React Native projects. And so choosing Gatsby, which is built on React, means that staffing a project will be very simple and the large majority of our developers will be able to contribute. And since Gatsby does construct pages statically, you get some search engine optimization and performance benefits pretty much out of the box, especially useful since we have our kind of on-the-go mobile audience. And we also really appreciate Gatsby's bring your data philosophy. It can consume multiple sources server-side when building the pages like Contentful, and then since it does use React, we know we could interact with more complex APIs in the future, like maybe authentication for user profiles down the line. For Contentful, we've also had great experiences with that. We used it to build a drink ordering app for Phil's Coffee. Listeners on the West Coast may have had a chance to try it out. We also used it for our own website, which if you check out is pretty complicated since designers made it. I like Contentful because it's super developer friendly. The way that they set up content modeling and have introduced environments, it's just kind of familiar concept to how I'm used to setting up models and environments in my code. I love the image API, which just makes resizing, cropping, etc. really simple. And Contentful also gives you an option of using a GraphQL API. If you've used Contentful with Gatsby before, you know you don't actually need to use that because Gatsby handles the GraphQL itself. But it's a nice thing to have if you're ever considering using the same data on another consumer, like a mobile app. And as a headless CMS, Contentful separates content from presentation. That's another check if you're ever considering a mobile app. And we also like it because our designs do tend to be pretty complex, and it's best in those cases to be handling raw data and plugging it into your complicated templates and components. And plus, Mailchimp was already using Contentful, so it's just an easy sell to say, use this tool you already like. And for Netlify, I sometimes describe Netlify to people who haven't used it as like the Heroku for static sites. It's just like, it's a tool built for exactly this kind of project, and it makes it really easy to kind of build and host static sites and single page apps. It's really easy to wire up webhooks so that code or content updates will rebuild the site. It integrates with GitHub so that as you open a PR, Netlify will make a build for that PR so developers can test each other's work without pulling things down locally. And it makes environment management very easy. When I've done Netlify projects, I usually just have like a staging branch, a QA branch, et cetera, and that does everything I need to do. Overall, I think Gatsby, Contentful, and Netlify work together really well. Here's a little diagram of kind of how they plug in so that updates to GitHub or Contentful will trigger Netlify to kick off a Gatsby build. And in my experience, I've been able to set up a flow like this in about 15 minutes using the different tools. So even though it looks complex, they make it very easy to work together. So I wanted to pick up where Dustin left off talking about dynamic content. As we were working on Mailchimp Presents, this was kind of like the kind of conventional thinking of what content to render where. So traditionally, you try to figure out clear your core page data and build that when you're building the site, and pair that with your core UI, and that's what should be part of the static template that's rendered from the server. And then client side, traditionally, we use that for dynamic data, things that actually weren't relevant on Mailchimp Presents yet, things like, are there items in your cart, or is there a user that's logged in? But as we were looking at the designs and the kind of functionality we wanted to achieve, we got another client-side use case, which was dynamic UI. Elements that are just complicated or significantly different on breakpoints, and that it's a lot easier to only render on the client side rather than jumping through hoops to get around the fact that when you're building the site, you don't know the window or the dimensions or the breakpoint. So one example of this is this kind of audio flourish that we have on the homepage for the featured podcast. To me, this is like a great candidate for something that you would only want to render on the client. It doesn't add any content value, so you wouldn't lose anything in terms of SEO. It looks significantly different between the desktop and mobile breakpoints. And just the way we were constructing it made it pretty difficult to do using CSS alone. So I'll talk about how we implemented it, but this was one case where we held off on rendering this component until we were on the client. Another example is recirculated content. So we have recommendations for what someone might also like, and those recommendations change every time someone loads the page. This was especially valuable when the project just launched and there wasn't that much content, so we wanted to kind of rotate the recommendations. There wasn't necessarily a sophisticated recommendation engine powering it. We just wanted to make sure different people saw different recommendations. And last, the nav bar. Any developer knows that like the nav is always the trickiest part of a site, and we had different behavior for different breakpoints, and depending on your scroll position, it was also different between for the home page, video pages like this one, and audio pages. Depending on what kind of page it was, that determined whether or not when and whether the logo faded out, what background the nav would have, and whether there'd be some player attached to it. So this was another great candidate to kind of defer figuring out until we got to the client side. So to accomplish this, we created the simple higher order component called render client. And this basically uses internal state and updates the component's internal state on component did mount, which will only run on the client. And when that state is updated, so we know that is client is true, we render the component that we wrapped this HOC around. Otherwise, we'll render null and just kind of hold off for now because it means we're still on the server. And this worked really well for the purposes of this project, but I do have a couple kind of ideas for the future I wanted to share for people looking into this approach. One, in some cases, it might benefit you to have a default setting for the content served from the server before you have a chance to measure. For recirculated content, for example, we could have had some kind of default recommendations that show up until we mount. Another kind of like Dustin's examples, we could use the use effect React hook because first of all, we'd be using hooks, so we'd be cool. And then the use effect hook also only runs on the client side. And it can be if you're waiting for some data, it can be a good way to kind of illustrate the relationship between the data you're querying and the component that's going to render. And last, documentation. The reason I bring this up, I think our solution wound up being very simple, but if you try to find out how to do this on React or Gatsby or other server-side libraries like Next, it's hard to find examples because I think people do have this idea that you should really just render things on the server unless it's like items in your cart. It's hard to figure out what to do, and sometimes people's first pass is doing something like checking if the window exists, and like React's reconciling between server and client can confuse that. You'll wind up with like tags nested in ways that don't make sense. So I've definitely seen people spin their wheels on this problem. So I think we can all chip in and open source and try to add more documentation, blog posts, examples of how to do this so that when people do run into this problem, they know what they should be doing. All right, I also wanted to dig into the content model that we used with Contentful. So here we kind of had competing goals. Developers hate repeating themselves. We love reusable code. If we see a title and description that have the same rules and exist on both a podcast and a documentary, we will go insane. And content editors, and to avoid that, we typically nest content or nest these structures. Content editors kind of have the opposite perspective where they like things to be nice and flat. They're not in charge of maintaining the models, just filling them out. So it can stress them out to have to publish something, go to a nested model, publish that, et cetera, and kind of keep track of what's been published. So they prefer a flat structure and want to make sure things are easy to edit and that they'll be easy to scale as different content types are added. So with those competing goals in mind, we came up with a structure that looks like this. You can see it's kind of flat-ish. I think given the complexity of the data, this is a pretty good representation. I think our worst level of nesting is about 5 deep here. And if we fill in the fields and then zoom in on kind of our core content types, you can see that there are a lot of repeated fields like description, short description, label, etc. So to kind of solve the wants of both developers and content editors, we were able to encapsulate this repetition in our scripts so that we could kind of store the rules in a common place, but without making things nested so it would be hard to edit. So to manage all that, we used 3 techniques. We used the Contentful migration library, which lets you create and update your schema. And here's where we had scripts that had repeated blocks. So if Amy came to us and said, I want the short description to have a different character limit, I could make that change in one place, and then it would propagate to all the different models that use that same short description field. We also use the Contentful CLI, which lets you export and import data and move it around between spaces and environments. And sometimes we had to kind of manually intervene as well. Sometimes we had to log into the Contentful web app. Like if we needed to purge data from an environment because we were tweaking the schema so much, we'd otherwise run into validation issues. And we also, one thing that was kind of frustrating, even though you can do a lot with Contentful migration, there's no way to change the order of fields that we could find. So if you wanted to move it so the title was ahead of the description, we'd have to log in and do that with our mice. So it was kind of thing where there was like a lot of different tools involved, but our powers combined, we were able to do everything we needed with our Contentful setup. And a couple other tidbits about the project I wanted to mention. Accessibility is a core value we have at Work & Co. And for Mailchimp Presents, we were shooting for a AA level of accessibility according to the WCAG guidelines. And one thing that helped us along the way was a tool that was added in Gatsby V2, Reach Router. So I worked on one of Work & Co.'s first big accessibility projects, the new website for Aldo shoes. And one problem we ran into is that browsers don't know how to interpret web apps the same way they do conventional sites. When you change a page, the browser won't understand where the focus went or won't announce that the page changed. And Reach Router helps to solve this problem. It basically says, like, listen, just pretend it's like a conventional website. It just happens to be really fast and snappy. So we were excited to get that for free. Another thing I wanted to talk about was schema generation and the way that Gatsby and Contentful work together. So Gatsby interacts with Contentful, queries your data, and uses that to construct a schema. And they work pretty well together, but sometimes you run into an issue. This might be familiar to those of you who have worked with the two tools. And even though the problem can be a little frustrating, I wanted to talk about it because it really helped me understand how all the tools involved work, including how GraphQL works. So the way that Gatsby works is it creates the schema, or like the rules for your data, based on the data that's currently on your site. So let's say this is the data for my homepage. Gatsby's gonna query that when I build the site and create a schema for the fields that are allowed to be there. And now in my Gatsby code, if I try to look up content like this, everything's going to be fine because those fields match the schema. But let's say that the slides are actually optional. And today I feel like I don't need them. They're not necessary for the content I'm trying to promote on the homepage. Now Gatsby will still recreate the schema, but now it's basing it off this data, which doesn't include all those fields as before. So even though my code hasn't changed, I'm still looking for these SRC and caption fields, and GraphQL is going to be like, what? What's a caption? I've never heard of that. And the site will actually refuse to build. There are a couple ways to fix this. On the Whittle School, I created a Contentful model called Dummy Content Index, which was basically a model that had relationships to any entry I needed to make that had placeholder content. Because basically the way you want to solve this problem, the kind of quick fix, is to make placeholder content so that you can fully build out that schema that your queries are expecting. This was kind of a quick and dirty solution. I did feel important using caps lock and don't delete a bunch. In Mailchimp Presents, we came up with a slightly more elegant solution where we made a system settings field, which had a schema definition Boolean, and when this was true, the content was designated as placeholder content. And in both cases, we had our scripts know that if you run into this kind of placeholder content, don't delete it, don't change it, just move it between environments. And we also had our Gatsby code know if you encounter a model designated as placeholder, never show it to the user because it's only intended to fill out the schema. So this got the job done, and we've used it on a couple of projects. But as I was researching these slides, I came across a new plugin for taking a snapshot of your schema. I'm not sure if anyone's used this yet. I haven't had a chance to, but it sounds really cool and like a step towards solving this problem, because basically you could take a snapshot of your schema at that point where it's fully built out, has all your carousel slides, etc., and then you can delete them and not worry about confusing Gatsby about what fields could possibly be there. So overall, we've had a really good time talking you through Mailchimp Presents, and we have a couple minutes for questions. So I think I'll turn it back over to Linda and we can start taking some questions.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah and Amy. So just a reminder for all the attendees to submit your questions in the question window. I have a couple to start with. One is, what would you say is the biggest success or win that moving to Gatsby has enabled for you?
That's for us at Work & Co?
Yes, that's right.
Sorry about that. Yeah, well, I think we work on projects for multiple clients, so we're choosing the technology for depending on the project. But I think when we have chosen Gatsby, often for sites like this that are very data driven, often going from a CMS, we've just been happy that a lot of things are taken care of for you. Kind of what Dustin was saying, like, as developers, we want to unique problems and not just like the same problem over and over. So I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to connect an app to Contentful. I want to solve like a complicated nav visualization problem. So we've just been impressed that Gatsby lets you kind of forget about that stuff. And one more thing I'll add is a lot of us are very into GraphQL, and I found that Gatsby is a great way to kind of first expose people to GraphQL, and maybe after a Gatsby project, then they'll be willing to do, or they'll be able to do a project that involves us like creating our own GraphQL server.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Next question is around content editors. And somebody's curious, how difficult was it to train your content editors to use Contentful? Like if you were to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, with, I guess, 10 being the most difficult, or 1 being the easiest.
So they actually were familiar with Contentful, which is kind of why we chose it, which is a sneaky answer. But I will say that the way that there was a lot of discussion around how can we prevent them from messing up, to be honest, and that sort of, we had to add, like, for example, what we were talking about with the schema, we had to make sure that if they made a mistake, it wouldn't crash the site. So we did add a lot of measures there so that when they did go in, they wouldn't need a lot of training. So we did kind of like take the burden off of them in that way. But in general, I do feel Contentful is like pretty straightforward. It can be a little bit limiting, but for kind of what we were set out to do, it was a really good tool.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Have you had to worry about internationalization or localization for this site? And if so, how do you manage that?
It didn't come up for this project, but on the other project I mentioned, the Whittle School, we did have both translation and localization. We had a different site for users accessing from China, and then that site needed to be available in Chinese and English. So Contentful's translations did make that simple. You can basically set it up so that any field that's not kind of like a core data field, or you can choose which fields are available to be translated, and you can kind of, if you want, use English as your default language. One area that did get a little tricky though was that we didn't just want English and Chinese. We wanted a different version of English for users going to the China site versus users going to the US site, because they'd be looking at campuses in the different countries, and there might be cultural differences too. So in that case, we found the best solution was to create 2 Contentful spaces, because even though there was the same structure involved, it was like Contentful's translations are really meant to be translations, and if you're making more like editorial changes between regions, we found it was better to create a separate space.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And this is more of a question for me, but there was a question came up about this webinar being recorded. It is being recorded, so if you missed any portion of it or the beginning of it, the recording will be available on our website later today. We'll also send an email out with the link to the recording, so just in case you missed any part of it. Okay, well, I think we're good now. So thank you so much to both of our guest presenters, Amy and Sarah, as well as our Gatsby presenter, Dustin. And thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. We'll follow up, as I said, with the link to the recording, and then hopefully we'll catch you next time. We'll be doing a webinar in November, and more details about that will be coming soon. So thanks again, everyone, for joining today.